A little boy pulls a nurse aside in an empty corridor and tells her something the doctors refuse to believe. His father, a wounded Navy SEAL, is drowning in nightmares every single night, and only she can pull him out of them. The attending physician thinks she's overstepping. The boy thinks she's the only adult in the building who actually listens. Then, in the dead of night, the captain's heart starts to fail, and the quiet nurse does something that shouldn't be possible for someone with her paperwork. What comes out afterward changes everything anyone in that hospital thought they knew about her. If stories about hidden strength speak to you, tap like, subscribe to our channel, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from tonight. The boy found her first, before anyone else on that floor understood what was happening. Elena Cross was resetting in 4-pump outside room 309, a task that didn't need her full attention, which was exactly why 8-year-old Theo Rourke chose that moment to catch her sleeve and pull her half a step closer. He gets scared at night, Theo whispered, like it was a secret too heavy to say at full volume. And it hurts him. His chest. You're the only one who makes it stop. Elena crouched without hesitation, meeting him eye to eye, her voice low and even. I'm not leaving tonight, she promised. Your dad's going to be okay. He didn't look convinced. He rarely did anymore. 6 nights running, he'd claimed the vinyl recliner beside his father's bed as his own personal watchtower, and in all that time, Elena was the only staff member he'd let within arm's reach without flinching. Across the room, Dr. Aldridge stood with his clipboard against his chest like a shield, watching her the way he always did, as though her presence on his unit were some kind of clerical error waiting to be corrected. Nurse Cross, he said, letting the syllables land with just enough weight to sting. A word when you're finished with story time. She straightened, cobalt scrubs pressed and unremarkable, badge turned outward the way regulations required. Nothing about her appearance suggested she was anything other than exactly what her ID claimed. Of course, doctor. She followed him a few steps from the bed, close enough that Theo could still see her, far enough that Aldridge's particular brand of condescension wouldn't reach the boy's ears. Captain Rourke's vitals have been erratic for 6 nights, Aldridge said. And the only thing that seems to steady him is you, sitting with him, not medication, not my orders. I talked to him. That's all. You do considerably more than talk to him. His eyes narrowed. I reviewed your credentials this morning. Associate's degree. No advanced certifications. And somehow you're the one person on this floor capable of pulling a decorated combat veteran back from wherever his mind takes him at 3 a.m. Maybe I'm good at my job. Nobody's that good at a job they were never trained for, Elena. Aldridge had built his entire identity around what could be proven on paper. A fellowship here, a publication there, a wall of framed accolades he mentioned in casual conversation, more often than seemed necessary. He didn't trust anything that couldn't be traced back to an institution, and he was never going to understand the kind of training that left no transcript behind. Captain Rourke has documented PTSD and a healing thoracic incision that needs protecting, Aldridge continued. He requires psychiatric consultation, not a nurse who happens to be good with a frightened kid. I'm filing for a transfer in the morning. He's not ready for that. That's not your determination to make. Elena held his gaze a beat too long, an old habit she'd never fully unlearned. Never look away first. Never let them think you've lost your footing. She caught herself and dropped her eyes half a second late. Aldridge noticed. He noticed everything that refused to fit his idea of her. Doctor, a voice called from behind the curtain. Something's happening with 309's monitor. Elena was already moving before the sentence finished. Captain Marcus Rourke lay exactly where he had for 6 nights, and 4 taped to the back of his hand, a surgical dressing visible above his gown where a partial thoracotomy incision was still knitting itself closed. 43 years old, career Navy, the kind of service record that made junior staff lower their voices when they read his chart. His eyes were open. Wrong kind of open. Captain, Elena said, dropping into the register she reserved for men whose bodies were present while their minds were somewhere else entirely. You're at Brightwater. You're safe here. He didn't register the words. His hand closed around the bed rail hard enough to whiten his knuckles, breath coming in short, ragged pulls. The monitor behind him climbed. 136, 142, 150. Theo, step back for me, sweetheart, Elena said, and the boy obeyed instantly, retreating into Aldridge's outstretched arm at the doorway. Aldridge reached for the call button. He's tachycardic. I'm calling it in. Wait. She wasn't looking at Aldridge. She was watching Rourke's fingers, tapping against the rail in a pattern too deliberate to be tremor. 3 taps. Pause. 2 taps. Pause. A civilian would have written it off as a symptom. It wasn't a symptom. It was a signal, drilled so deep into an operator's muscle memory that it survived even when everything else went dark. Captain Rourke, she said, and pressed her palm flat against his sternum, steady, unhesitating. Status check. You're not in the field. Eyes on me. His head turned toward her voice before his conscious mind caught up to why. Breathe with me, she said. In for 4. She counted. His chest rose beneath her palm, unsteady but rising. Hold for 4. Aldridge had gone motionless behind her, phone half raised, watching something he had no framework for. Out for 4. The numbers began to fall. 144. 136. Not fast, but moving the right direction. Rourke's eyes finally landed on her face instead of whatever landscape his memory had dragged him back to. You're safe, Elena said quietly. You're at the hospital. Your son's right outside. Nobody's going to hurt you here. His breath shuddered loose, and for one unguarded second something in his expression cracked open. Not recognition of the room, but of her. The voice. The hands. Then exhaustion swallowed it whole, and he sank back into the pillows. Elena withdrew her hand, resetting her posture into something ordinary, unremarkable. But Aldridge was still watching her, and this time the look on his face wasn't irritation. It was suspicion. That's not a de-escalation protocol I've ever seen taught on this floor, he said slowly. It worked. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting right now. Your patient needs rest. She smoothed his blanket, rechecked the monitor, and didn't give Aldridge the satisfaction of a shaking hand, because hers weren't shaking. They never did in the moment. Only after, alone, when nobody was left to see it. In the doorway, Theo watched her with an expression too old for his face. He'd witnessed this every night for a week, and every night he'd told no one but her. You did the breathing thing, he whispered when she reached him. That's what fixes it. It's just a technique, buddy. Where'd you learn it? Elena crouched to meet him at eye level, the same posture she'd used 100 times checking pulses that didn't need checking. A long time ago, she said. From people who needed it worse than most. It was true. It just wasn't a truth she was permitted to explain. By morning, Aldridge had a plan, and men like Aldridge always dressed their plans up as concern. Transfer effective this afternoon, he announced during rounds, pitched loud enough for half the floor to hear. Captain Rourke's episodes are escalating. He needs a controlled psychiatric environment, not a general trauma ward. Elena stood at the medication cart, back turned, hands steady on a syringe that required no particular steadiness. He's 6 days post-op from a partial thoracotomy, she said without turning around. Moving him now risks the surgical site and destabilizes the one environment where he's actually improving. You'd be trading one danger for another. I'd be following protocol. Protocol doesn't know him. You do. That, Aldridge said, his voice sharpening, is precisely what concerns me. You've become this man's primary source of stability, and I don't understand why. Things I don't understand make me uneasy. She offered nothing in response. There was no answer that wouldn't open a door she needed to keep shut. 9 years earlier, Elena Cross hadn't existed at all. There had been a different name once, a call sign stenciled beneath the canopy of an F-15 that carried her through 3 combat rotations before a compressor stall and a rough ejection over hostile terrain ended that chapter of her life in roughly 4 seconds. She remembered the chute deploying too hard, the ground arriving at the wrong angle, the pale rope scar along her forearm that still ached in cold weather from a signal flare that had gone off too close during recovery. She remembered the combat rescue medic who'd stabilized her on that hillside, his voice low and metronomic, counting her breathing the exact way she now counted for other people, because that voice had kept her alive long enough to be found. 2 years of cross-training followed, learning to become that same steady presence for someone else. The work had taught her things no community college nursing program ever could. How to read a man's hands before his eyes told her anything true, how to locate a pulse buried under panic, how to keep a heart beating in conditions no clinical simulation ever bothered to replicate. She'd left the uniform behind 3 years ago, after an extraction that went right for everyone except the part of her that used to sleep through a full night undisturbed. Nursing felt like the nearest thing to that old work she still believed in, steady, useful, quiet. She had built Elena Cross deliberately, a name and a life that asked nothing of her former rank, a place to stand without carrying the weight of who she used to be. Nursing school had come almost embarrassingly easy after everything before it. Her hands kept assembling checklists for arterial bleeds and tension pneumothoraxes, while instructors lectured on things she'd learned to manage in far worse light. She never told a single classmate the truth. It was simpler to be underestimated. Underestimated people got left alone. What she hadn't accounted for was an 8-year-old with better instincts than half the residents on staff, or a patient whose fractured mind kept reaching, night after night, for a voice it had no logical reason to remember at all. Aldridge knew none of it. He only knew the results didn't match the resume, and men who'd spent their careers proving themselves through paperwork rarely trusted results that arrived without any. "I'll be submitting my transfer recommendation to the attending of record," he said. "You're welcome to file an objection." He left the way he always did, as though the conversation had ended precisely where he'd intended it to. Down the hall, Theo sat curled in the recliner beside his father's bed, a coloring book untouched in his lap, having heard every word through the gap in the curtain, the way children learn to listen when the adults around them assume they aren't. When Elena came to check the captain's vitals, Theo was waiting. "They're going to move him," he said. "It wasn't a question. Nothing's decided yet, buddy. You told me you'd stay." "I'm trying." His small hands twisted at the edge of the coloring book. "The other nurses are scared of him. I can tell. They stand by the door and don't come close." He looked up at her with the particular directness only children manage, cutting straight past every deflection an adult might reach for. "You're not scared. Why aren't you?" Elena glanced at Rourke, sleeping now, chest rising in the slow rhythm of exhausted rest, one hand still curled at his side the way a hand curls around a weapon that no longer exists. "Because I've seen this before," she said, the words out before she could stop them. "Seen what?" "Never mind. Come help me check his blood pressure. You can hold the cuff." It was a cheap distraction, but he took it anyway, sliding off the recliner with the gravity of a boy handed an important assignment. She wrapped the cuff around his father's arm and let him press the button, watched his face light with quiet pride at the machine's soft whir. For a moment the room felt almost normal. A nurse, a boy, a recovering man, numbers climbing steadily on a screen, nothing that belonged in any incident report. Then Theo's voice dropped again, softer, like he'd been building toward this for days. "He says a word sometimes," he told her. "When he's stuck in the bad place at night. It's not a real word. It's like a code." Elena's hands stilled on the cuff. "What word?" Theo frowned, working to get it exactly right. "He said it again right before you came in, and did the breathing thing last night." He looked up at her, solemn. "Do you know what it means?" She kept her expression carefully blank, the same stillness she'd once used through debriefs and depositions, every conversation that could unravel a life she'd built with great care. "I don't know," she lied. "Maybe it's just something from a dream." But she did know. She'd known the instant his mouth began to shape the sound, because it wasn't a random syllable pulled from a stranger's nightmare. It was a call sign. Her call sign, spoken by a man she was almost certain she'd never met, which meant either her memory had failed her, or Captain Marcus Rourke's nightmares were dragging up a mission that had never made it into any file at all. Either way, the quiet, ordinary life she'd assembled so carefully had just tilted beneath her, and she had the sinking feeling that Aldridge's transfer paperwork was the least of what was coming. "You'll find out what it means, right?" Theo asked, letting go of the cuff, his face set with the seriousness of someone who'd just made this his job too. "It's important. I can tell." "I'll figure it out," Elena said, and meant it more than she wanted to. She finished the vitals with steady hands and an unsteady mind, and once she stepped into the empty corridor, she let herself feel, for the first time in 3 years, genuinely afraid of what remembering might cost her. The transfer paperwork still sat untouched on the nurse's station counter at 2 in the morning when Rourke's monitor began to scream. Elena was 3 doors down, but she was already moving before the second tone finished, some part of her having been braced for this since the boy first said the word. She hit the curtain at a dead run. Rourke was half out of bed, the 4 torn free and swinging, one hand clawed against his own chest where fresh blood had begun blooming through the dressing, the other swinging wide at something only he could see. His eyes were open, empty in the same terrible way as before, except worse. His body wasn't frozen this time. It was fighting. "Get security," a night nurse said. "No," Elena's voice sliced through the room. "Not security. 2 units of saline, and Paige the surgical resident. Now." She didn't approach the way you're taught to approach a combative patient, hands raised, bracing for impact. She stepped inside his reach instead, low and close, catching his flailing wrist in a controlled grip that redirected momentum instead of resisting it, pinning his arm against his own chest without wasting a single motion. "Marcus." Not Captain. Not Sir. His given name, sharp and immediate, the way you say a name to yank someone back from somewhere very far away. Marcus, look at me. He didn't. His breath tore in and out of him, and beneath her hand she could feel his heart slamming against a surgical site that had no business absorbing that kind of stress, hard enough that she already knew, with the flat certainty of someone who'd witnessed this exact failure before, that they had minutes, not hours. Pressure's dropping, a nurse called out from the monitor. 90/58 and falling. Heart sounds are, she paused, stethoscope pressed to his chest, going pale. Muffled. I can barely hear them. Distant heart sounds. Falling pressure. Distended neck veins visible even through his panic. Elena's training assembled the picture faster than the rest of the room could process it. Blood collecting in the sac around his heart, likely from strain on the healing incision, squeezing the chamber tighter with every beat until it could no longer fill. Cardiac tamponade. It would kill him before the surgical team finished scrubbing in. She had seen this exact failure mode once before, on a hillside years earlier, a different man, a different wound, the same brutal math of a heart drowning in its own blood while everyone argued about the correct procedure. She hadn't had an ultrasound then. No sterile field, no crash cart, no backup arriving in minutes instead of an hour. She'd had a folding knife, a length of tubing, and about 90 seconds to decide whether protocol or survival mattered more. Tonight she had better tools. The decision hadn't changed at all. He needs decompression now, Elena said. Not in 10 minutes. We wait for the resident, the night nurse insisted. He doesn't have 10 minutes. She was already moving, one hand braced against Rourke's shoulder, holding him still with a pressure point technique no nursing manual had ever taught her, the other reaching for the crash cart. Prep a pericardiocentesis tray, she said to the nurse beside her. Betadine, an 18-gauge spinal needle, and get the ultrasound if it's in the room. You can't do that, the night nurse said again. Watch me. The doors banged open. Aldridge, half into his scrubs, summoned by the code alarm, took in the scene in a single furious sweep. What is happening? Cardiac tamponade, post-thoracotomy, decompensating in real time, Elena said, not looking up, her hands already moving with an economy of motion that belonged nowhere near an associate's degree. I need this room clear of everyone who isn't helping. You are not authorized to perform an invasive cardiac procedure. Then you do it. Right now. Or you step back and let me, because in about 90 seconds his heart stops, and I promise you a malpractice review beats a dead patient. The room went silent in a way that carried weight. Aldridge looked at Rourke, gray, gasping, the alarm shrieking a number climbing in the wrong direction. Something in his expression fractured, the first real crack Elena had seen in him since she'd started at Brightwater. Do it, he said. I'll guide you. Talk me through what you're seeing. It wasn't trust. It was arithmetic. Her hands were steady, and his weren't yet, not with adrenaline just now flooding him. But it was enough. Elena prepped the site below the sternum with a hand that didn't waver, found her angle with the ultrasound probe another nurse pressed into place, and guided the needle in with the same unhurried precision she'd used a lifetime ago on a hillside, on a man whose name she'd never learned, whose chest had also been filling with blood he couldn't afford to lose. Angling toward the left shoulder, she said, half to Aldridge, half to steady her own breathing. Aspirating now. Dark blood drew into the syringe. 20 milliliters. 40. 60. On the monitor behind her, Rourke's pressure began, impossibly, to climb toward numbers that meant survival. His breathing evened. His grip on her wrist, iron a moment before, loosened. His eyes, when they finally focused, found her face with a clarity absent for 6 nights running. You're okay, Elena said, quieter now that the room had stopped fighting itself. Stay with me, Marcus. He stared at her for a long moment, something behind his eyes surfacing through the exhaustion and blood loss and days of medication, something closer to recognition than confusion. I know that voice, he murmured. I know it from somewhere I can't place. Behind them, Aldridge hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, watching Elena strip off blood-streaked gloves with hands that had just performed a procedure most attendings only touched a handful of times in a career. In the doorway, wide awake despite the hour, Theo stood wrapped in a borrowed blanket, watching all of it with the same unblinking gravity he brought to everything. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a boy who had finally seen proof of something he'd known all along. A nurse gently steered him back toward the recliner, murmuring that his father was going to be fine. But Theo twisted around once more to catch Elena's eye across the rail and mouthed 2 words she nearly missed in the chaos resettling around her. Thank you. Silent. Absolutely certain. The certainty of a child who had spent 6 sleepless nights believing something no adult would take seriously, and had finally watched the world catch up to what he'd known the entire time. By 7 that morning, Elena had been summoned to a conference room she'd never once set foot in, its door labeled clinical compliance, and a man at the head of the table introduced himself as Director Whitfield, Patient Safety. Aldridge sat beside him, a folder open in front of him that she recognized as the incident report he must have started drafting before the sun rose. "Ms. Cross," Whitfield said, not yet looking up from his notes. "Last night you performed an invasive cardiac procedure without a physician's order, without confirmed sterile field, and without documented training. That patient is alive because of what you did. I want that on record. But I answer to a hospital board and a nursing board that will ask why a nurse with an associate's degree performed something most of our attendings only manage under supervision. I understand. Do you?" Aldridge leaned forward. "Because what I understand, Ms. Cross, is that you moved like someone who has done that exact procedure before. More than once. Somewhere considerably worse than a hospital room with an ultrasound and a crash cart." She said nothing. The silence carried more weight than any answer could have. "I pulled your file this morning," Aldridge went on. 2-year nursing program, 3 years ago. No prior clinical employment anywhere. No military service on record. And yet last night you performed field trauma medicine with precision I've watched surgical fellows fail to achieve after 6 years of training." His usual condescension had drained away, replaced by something closer to genuine bewilderment. "I need you to explain that. Not for the report. For me. It would have been easy to keep lying." She'd built an entire life on the ease of a good cover story, and part of her, the part conditioned to disappear cleanly and often, was already reaching for the next deflection. But she thought of Theo, curled in that recliner, listening through a gap in the curtain, carrying a warning nobody would take seriously until it nearly cost his father everything. She thought of the word Rourke had spoken in the dark, a call sign that belonged to no stranger's nightmare, and of a hillside years earlier, where she'd knelt over a wounded operator whose face she'd never clearly seen through smoke and dust and a fogged visor, calling in an extraction while his pressure crashed beneath her hands. 5 operators pulled out that night. She'd never learned a single name. Command had structured it that way on purpose. Call signs only, faces obscured, both sides compartmentalized so a compromised operation couldn't be traced through personal connection. She had been a voice and a pair of hands. Nothing more, nothing meant to outlast the extraction point. She remembered the debrief afterward more vividly than the mission itself. A colonel telling her plainly that 5 men were breathing because of a decision she'd made in under a minute, with no backup, in worse visibility than any simulator ever attempted to model. She remembered how little that praise had meant at 3 in the morning, staring at a ceiling, replaying a different extraction months later that hadn't gone as cleanly. Nobody had trained her for the part of the job that lingered in her chest long after the mission ended. Apparently, for one of those 5 men, it had lingered for years, buried below conscious memory, waiting for a familiar cadence of breath counting to drag it back to the surface. "Before I was a nurse," Elena said slowly, "I flew fighters for the Air Force. Then combat search and rescue, after an ejection, ended my flight status. I separated 3 years ago. My discharge paperwork is sealed under a classification review I'm not permitted to discuss, which is why none of it shows up on a standard background check." Whitfield's pen stopped. "You're telling me you have military trauma training that appears nowhere in your employment record," he said carefully. "I'm telling you I've stabilized worse injuries than Captain Rourke's, under worse conditions than this room, more times than I can count on both hands. I used that training last night because it was the only thing standing between him and a code blue. I'd do it again without hesitating." Aldridge studied her, the folder forgotten in front of him. "Why bury it? You could have worked as a flight medic, a trauma tech, something that used what you actually know. Why hide behind a nursing degree and pretend the rest never existed?" It was a question she'd never answered aloud, not to anyone, not even to herself in the years since she'd turned in her wings. "Because the last extraction I ran didn't go like the others," she said. "I got everyone out. I didn't get everyone out whole. I spent 2 years telling myself that if I set down every piece of who I used to be, I could finally stop carrying it. Nursing felt like the closest version of that work that didn't require staying her." Her jaw tightened. "Turns out you can change your name and your scrubs. You can't actually set the training down. It's still there the moment someone needs it." The room held its silence a while longer. "Captain Rourke," Whitfield said eventually, has been asking for you since he woke up an hour ago. Says he remembers something. Wants to tell you himself. Something tightened in her chest that had nothing to do with adrenaline. I'd like to see him. Aldridge closed his folder slower than necessary, buying himself a moment. This conversation isn't finished, Ms. Cross. There are licensing questions, scope of practice questions I still don't have good answers for. He paused at the door, and for the first time since she'd known him, his voice carried no edge at all. But I watched you save a man's life last night, doing something none of my fellows could have managed. Whatever you used to be, it's the reason he's still breathing. I'd be a fool not to hear the rest. It wasn't an apology. From a man like Aldridge, she suspected it was as close as one ever got. Down the hall, past the nurse's station and the coloring book still open on the recliner, Captain Marcus Rourke sat upright for the first time in 6 days, alert, focused, his son curled against his side with the fierce satisfaction of a boy proven right after everyone had doubted him. There she is, Theo said, tugging his father's sleeve the same way he'd tugged hers a lifetime ago the previous afternoon. Told you she'd know. Rourke looked different, steady in a way she hadn't seen since he'd first been wheeled onto the floor, older around the eyes but present. Close the curtain, he said quietly, and she did, giving them what privacy a hospital room could offer. Theo didn't move from his father's side, and Rourke didn't ask him to. Whatever this was, the boy had earned the right to hear it. 9 years ago, Rourke began without preamble, my team got pinned on a ridge we weren't supposed to be anywhere near. Shrapnel caught me in the chest. My corpsman went down before he could reach me. I remember losing feeling in my hands, thinking clearly that this was how it ended. He paused, gathering something that cost him visibly. And then there was a voice. A woman, counting my breathing, telling me I was safe when nothing about that mountain was safe. I never saw a face. Smoke, dust, my own blood in my eyes. Just hands that didn't shake, and a voice that didn't either. Elena stood very still. She remembered that ridge with a clarity that had never dulled. The static cutting in and out, the smell of scorched stone. A man's pulse fluttering thin beneath her fingers while she told him the extraction bird was 4 minutes out, then 3, then 90 seconds, her voice forced level even as her hands shook from cold. She had never known whether he survived the flight to the surgical unit. Command didn't share outcomes with extraction crews. You did the job, climbed back into the aircraft, and let the not knowing become one more weight carried in silence. They called her Halcyon, Rourke said. Never a real name over comms, just the sign. I asked around for years afterward, tried to find whoever had run that extraction, and every request came back sealed. Command told me the personnel on that operation were classified beyond my clearance, which made no sense for a man who'd bled out under her hands on the ground. But that's the answer I got, and eventually I stopped asking. Told myself it didn't matter who she was, only that she'd gotten me home. He looked at her, and Elena felt 9 years compress into a single breath. Last night, when everything went dark, I heard that voice again. Same cadence, same counting. I thought it was hallucination, grief, the drugs, whatever. And then this morning I remembered something I hadn't thought about in years. His jaw tightened. The voice on that ridge had a scar right here. He touched the inside of his forearm near the wrist. I saw it for half a second when her sleeve slipped, checking my pulse. A burn, like a flare had gone off too close. Elena's hand drifted, almost without permission, to her own forearm, to the mark she'd carried since her ejection 2 years before that mission, the one she never bothered hiding under long sleeves, because nobody at Brightwater had ever looked closely enough to ask. Captain Rourke. Marcus, he corrected. You called me Marcus last night, not Captain. I want to hear you say it again, and tell me I haven't lost my mind. Elena pulled her sleeve back without waiting to be asked, held her arm out, let him see the scar clearly for the first time in 9 years and half a lifetime. Halcyon was a call sign, she said quietly. I don't use it anymore, neither the name nor the person who carried it. But yes, that ridge, that extraction. That was me. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Theo looked between his father's face and Elena's with the wide-eyed solemnity of a child who understood, even without the details, that something enormous had just fallen into place. You saved my dad, he said finally, testing the sentence aloud for the first time. Before. Not just now. I helped a team get off a mountain, Elena said. I didn't know which of them made it home until about 30 seconds ago. Rourke's hand found hers, gripping it the way a man grips something he's afraid will vanish if he lets go. I've spent 9 years wondering whether the person who kept me breathing on that ridge ever knew what happened after. Whether it mattered. His voice cracked on the last word. "And you've been in this hospital the entire time, and I didn't recognize you until my own son heard you counting my breaths and put it together before I did." "He didn't put it together," Elena said, glancing at Theo. "He just refused to stop paying attention." "That's not nothing." Outside the curtain, footsteps approached, and a moment later Aldridge appeared, flanked by a man in dress uniform whose insignia Elena recognized instantly. A liaison officer from her old wing, summoned, she guessed, once Whitfield's compliance team started making calls that morning. "Ms. Cross," the officer said, and there was something almost formal in how he said it, a recognition of rank that hadn't technically existed in 3 years. "Command received a records inquiry this morning, tied to an incident report from this facility. Once your name surfaced in connection with the call sign referenced in Captain Rourke's chart, I was asked to confirm your service record in person, given the classification involved." And Aldridge asked, arms still crossed, though the posture had lost its old certainty. The officer's expression didn't change, but something like respect crept into his voice. "Captain Elena Cross, United States Air Force, retired. Combat Search and Rescue Liaison. 5 confirmed extractions under direct fire. Distinguished Flying Cross, prior to her transition out of fighter operations. Her record confirms everything Captain Rourke just described, down to the operation number." He turned to Aldridge. "Whatever procedure she performed last night, Doctor, I'd trust her hands over most surgeons I've served alongside." Aldridge didn't speak for a long moment. When he finally did, his voice carried none of the sharp edges she'd grown used to. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I spent a week assuming the gap between your credentials and your competence meant something was wrong. It never occurred to me the gap existed because the truth was classified, not because it wasn't there at all." "You weren't entirely unreasonable to be cautious," Elena said. "You didn't know what you were looking at. Now you do." Theo tugged her sleeve once more, quieter than before, like this part was meant only for her. "You're not just a nurse," he whispered. "No," Elena admitted, and for the first time in 3 years, saying it aloud didn't feel like losing anything at all. "I never really was. I just needed somewhere quiet to stand for a while." The liaison officer excused himself to make a call, and Aldridge lingered a moment longer than necessary, glancing between Rourke, the boy, and the woman he'd spent a week trying to catch in some kind of lie. Whatever he'd expected to find beneath Elena Cross's calm exterior, it hadn't been this. "I'll leave you 3, he said finally, and for once his exit felt like a man quietly recalculating everything he thought he'd understood. The Board of Nursing review took 3 weeks, and in the end it barely qualified as one. Whitfield submitted a statement documenting exigent circumstances, corroborated by a letter from Elena's former wing confirming her combat medical training far exceeded the scope of the procedure in question. Captain Rourke gave a statement of his own, blunt and unequivocal, that the nurse in question had saved his life twice, once on a mountainside 9 years earlier, once in a hospital bed 3 weeks before the hearing. The board cleared her without a formal reprimand, and in a move nobody at Brightwater had seen before, recommended her for a newly created position, Clinical Liaison for Veteran and Combat Trauma Care, reporting jointly to Nursing Administration and Dr. Aldridge. Aldridge hadn't fought the recommendation. He'd written it himself. The hearing was almost anticlimactic, a windowless room, a panel of 3, a stack of records telling a story none of them expected to read. Elena sat through it with the same stillness she'd carried through every debrief of her old life, answering plainly while Whitfield's statement and the liaison officer's confirmation did most of the work for her. Nobody asked about the ridge. The results spoke clearly enough on their own. "You'll still carry a normal patient load," Aldridge told her the day the position was finalized, standing in a hallway that no longer felt like enemy territory. "But when we get someone like Rourke, combat veterans, first responders, anyone whose trauma doesn't fit neatly into a standard consult, you'll be the first call. I should have called you first from the start. I was too busy admiring my own credentials to notice who was actually doing the work." "You noticed eventually," Elena said. "That's more than most people manage." "For what it's worth," Aldridge added, "I've spent 15 years believing competence and credentials were the same thing. You didn't fit the equation, so I assumed the equation was still right, and you were the exception that needed explaining away. I intend to be more careful about that going forward." It was, she thought, as close to redemption as a man like Aldridge was built for, and she'd take it. What mattered was whether people started moving in the right direction once the truth reached them, and Aldridge, for all his old certainty, had begun to move. The weeks that followed carried their own quiet momentum. Her new position took shape slowly. A shared office down the hall from the trauma unit. A referral pathway Whitfield helped design so combat veterans admitted anywhere in the hospital could be flagged for her within the hour instead of days. Aldridge, of all people, became her steadiest advocate among the medical staff, quietly correcting colleagues who assumed her title meant less than it did. A young nurse named Priya, who'd helped prep the pericardiocentesis tray that night, began shadowing her on slower shifts, taking notes on techniques with no equivalent in any textbook she'd ever been issued. "Any chance you'll teach a class on all this someday?" Priya asked one afternoon, half joking. "Working on it," Elena said, and meant it. Whitfield had already floated a formal training track, recognizing distress signals in veterans, de-escalation under physiological extremes, built around exactly the instinct that had carried her through that first terrible night with Rourke. Captain Rourke was discharged on an ordinary, sunbright Thursday, walking out under his own power, surgical site healed, his son's hand locked tightly in his. He stopped at the nurse's station on his way out, in civilian clothes for the first time since Elena had met him, looking less like a patient, and more like the man he must have been before a ridge and a compressor stall had each taken something from both of them. "I looked you up," he said. "Once I had a name to search. Distinguished Flying Cross, 5 extractions under fire. You never told anyone here any of that. It wasn't relevant to changing 4 bags. It was relevant to everything." He shook his head, something caught between laughter and disbelief. 9 years I've been trying to thank a voice I couldn't put a face to. Never imagined I'd get to do it in person, in a hospital hallway, with my kids standing right here. "You don't have to thank me. I know I don't have to. I'm gonna anyway." He offered his hand, and she took it, and something settled between them that needed no further words. "I want you to know something else," Rourke added, quieter, glancing down at his son. "Theo hasn't slept a full night through since we got home from my last deployment, well before any of this. Nightmares of his own, from watching mine too many times. Last night was the first time in months he slept 8 hours straight. Told me it was because he finally knew someone would catch it. Whatever comes next, that's not a small thing you gave him. I don't think you fully understand how big it is." Elena looked down at Theo, who was very deliberately pretending not to listen to a conversation he was clearly absorbing with his entire body. "I understand it better than you'd guess," she said. "I know what it's like to need someone to catch it and have no one there. He won't have that problem. Not while I'm here." Theo, meanwhile, had planted himself directly in front of her, arms crossed in an almost perfect imitation of the way Aldridge used to stand, though on an 8-year-old it read considerably less intimidating. "You're staying here, right? In case Dad needs the breathing thing again." "I'm not going anywhere, buddy. I promised you that the first day." "You never told me you used to fly jets," he said, with the particular indignation of a child who feels cheated out of something enormous. "I'm telling you now. Will you tell me about it? All of it. Not the boring hospital version. The real one." Elena knelt to his eye level, the same posture she'd used that first afternoon checking a blood pressure cuff that never needed checking, before any of this had cracked open. "Some of it's still classified," she said. "But I can tell you the important part. The part where a very brave 8-year-old refused to stop paying attention, even when nobody believed him. That's the reason your dad is standing right here today, instead of somewhere much worse." Theo weighed this with the gravity of a boy handling a great responsibility. "So I helped save him too?" "You did more than help. You noticed something was wrong when every single adult in this building, myself included, was too busy following the usual script. That matters. Don't let anyone tell you it doesn't." He beamed, and for a moment he was simply a kid again, not a night watchman standing guard over his father's worst hours, just a boy proud of himself in a hospital hallway on the day everyone finally got to go home. Elena watched them cross through the sliding doors together, father and son, into ordinary daylight, and felt something in her chest loosen that had stayed clenched since a mountainside 9 years earlier, and a career she'd once tried to fold small enough to forget entirely. She hadn't set down her training by changing her name. She understood that now. She'd only been waiting for the right person to need it again, and for a child brave enough to keep insisting, against every skeptical adult around him, that what he'd witnessed actually mattered. Some warnings don't arrive through intelligence briefings or classified channels. Sometimes they come from a boy tugging your sleeve in a hospital corridor, telling you the one true thing nobody else was paying close enough attention to hear. She turned back toward the unit, cobalt scrubs, badge turned outward, and went to check on her next patient. Not hiding anymore. Simply doing, at last, Exactly the work she'd always been meant for, in the open, under her own name. 6 months later, on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, the hospital's first formal training session for the new Veteran Trauma Liaison Program filled the same conference room where Elena had once sat across from Whitfield and Aldridge, waiting to learn whether her old life would cost her the new one. This time the room held a dozen nurses, 2 residents, and a handful of trauma techs, all leaning forward the way Priya once had, trying to absorb something no manual had ever managed to capture. Aldridge sat in the back row, arms uncrossed for once, taking his own notes like everyone else. The technique isn't magic, Elena told them, standing at the front without notes or a podium, the same way she'd once knelt beside a dying man on a hillside without a manual either. It's pattern recognition. A nervous system in crisis behaves the same way, whether it's on a battlefield or in a hospital bed. Your job isn't to fix the crisis. It's to give the body something steadier to follow back out of it. A voice, a rhythm, a hand that doesn't shake. That's the whole of it. A resident in the second row raised her hand. What if you don't have the training? What if you're just a regular nurse who notices something's off? Then you do what an 8-year-old boy did for me, Elena said, warmth threading through her voice in a way it rarely did in a classroom. You pay attention when everyone else stops paying attention. You say something even when you're not sure anyone will believe you. Sometimes that's the entire job. The rest you learn. Captain Rourke still stopped by occasionally, not as a patient, but the way people do once a place has woven itself into a part of their life they aren't ready to release entirely. Theo, an inch taller now, had taken to carrying his own notebook, filling it with questions about pulse points and pressure dressings the way other kids his age collected baseball cards. Elena answered every one honestly, the way she wished someone had once answered hers, and found that teaching a curious boy the mechanics of staying steady under pressure did something for the old weight she'd carried alone for years. She kept a folded page from that coloring book pinned above her desk, a crude but careful drawing Theo had made during that first terrible week, a nurse and a boy standing together beside a hospital bed beneath a bright yellow sun. Underneath, in handwriting that had grown slightly steadier since, someone had written, "The one who caught it." Being unseen for 3 years hadn't made her work matter any less. It only meant that the people who finally did see it would never, for the rest of their lives, forget it. The end. Rank and title tell you what someone used to carry. They never tell you what someone is capable of right now in the room, when it matters. Elena Cross spent 3 years hiding behind a nursing badge because she believed setting down her old life meant setting down its weight too. She was wrong. The training never left her. It was only waiting for someone who needed it again, and it took an 8-year-old boy, dismissed by every adult around him, to see clearly what the grown-ups in that hospital took a week to understand. That the people who show up quietly, who keep paying attention when everyone else stops, are very often the ones who save us. Don't let a diploma decide for you who deserves your trust. Pay attention to what someone actually does when it counts. If this story moved you, hit like, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe to our channel for more.